For over 50 years, Kirby Morgan has revolutionized commercial diving. From masks to helmets and everything in between. Dive into history with us as we step into the Dive Locker. The Kirby Morgan Commercial Helium Helmet. This helmet was nearly identical to the KMHEH-1, with the addition of the carbon dioxide absorbent container, Venturi system, mixed gas supply valve, and reduction regulator. Again, these helmets were made and sold by Bob Kirby prior to 1965 with the brass identification plates R. Kirby Commercial Helmet, Santa Barbara, California. From 1965 and on, the hats were identified with the Kirby Morgan plates. The divers involved in the original design were Bob Kirby, Kenny Knott, Ed Wood, Jerry Todd, and Del Tomlinson. The helmet differed in many ways from the U.S. Navy standard Mark V helium helmet, inasmuch as a standard medical soda-sorb CO2 absorbent chemical cartridge was placed in the rear-mounted canister fitted on the back of the helmet. This allowed 4 improvements. First, the absorbent canister was pre-packed. Second, it installed from the inside of the helmet prior to donning, so there were no fittings exposed to make or break leaks. Third, the entire bonnet, including absorbent chamber and absorbent, were donned as one unit just prior to water entry. The fourth improvement was the reducer valve that fed gas to the Venturi nozzle. It automatically fed the Venturi with a preset pressure gas mix, which freed up the rack operator on deck from the chore of chasing the diver with an over-bottom regulator on deck. These reducer valves were simply a scuba first stage valve from a single hose scuba regulator. This style of recirculatory helmet was the first practical commercial helium helmet with a Venturi. Robert Galeazzi of Italy had been granted an American patent in 1957 for a helium helmet that used a demand system. 6 years later, Mr. H. Dan Wilson successfully used his own style of demand system helium helmet. Of course, the pioneer in gas diving was the U.S. Navy, who showed the way in the 1920s. This was followed by the mixed gas saturation work of Captain George Bond, USN, in the 1950s and 1960s. Morgan worked on gas helmets that had the original R. Kirby plaques, prior to building the helmet having Kirby Morgan plaques. No production numbers stated, but probably less than 20 units were made with the Kirby Morgan manufacturer plaques. Bev learned this metalwork very, very quickly. Within a couple of weeks, he could solder and silver solder as well as I could. Amazing. Those 2 helmets are the absolute pinnacle of heavy gear helmets. What I considered the best team of commercial divers in the world came up with the helium hat design and put it together with Kirby, who I considered about the world's best metal bender. That Kirby Air hat was as good as a heavy gear helmet could ever get. Sure, there had been some small improvements over the years on CB's original design, but what Kirby came up with was a giant leap. Ask anyone who's dove one, and I had nothing to do with that. It was all Kirby. He showed me how to build them, but that's it. My name has no business being on those hats. All I ever did on them was follow Bob. This concludes this episode of the Diving into the Kirby Morgan Archives. Stay tuned for the next episode of The Dive Locker.